It's hard to imagine what it feels like to be 16 and completely alone in a place that's supposed to shape your future. For David, every morning meant walking into a classroom where no one looked like him, where every stare reminded him he didn't belong. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted to learn, to fit in, to be seen as more than the color of his skin. This is not just his story. It's the story of what happens when a school reflects the divisions of a nation. David was 16 years old when his parents moved to the South. His father had just accepted a factory job, and his mother worked double shifts at a diner to help keep the family afloat. They weren't wealthy. They weren't chasing some dream of luxury. They were simply trying to survive like millions of families across America in the late 1960s. The neighborhood they settled into was quiet, but the school, Jefferson High, was anything but ordinary. For most kids, the first day of school is about nervous excitement, new classes, new teachers, maybe a few new friends. For David, it was something else entirely. It was the realization that when he stepped through those heavy steel doors, he would be walking into a world where almost no one looked like him. Jefferson High was 99% black. The halls were filled with voices, laughter, inside jokes, and rhythms David didn't understand yet. He wasn't blind to history. He had seen the news, heard his parents' hushed conversations about segregation and change. But until that day, those headlines had always been distant, happening to someone else. Now, they were his reality. First morning, David stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt over and over again. His mother kissed him on the forehead and told him to be brave. His father, never one for many words, just said, "Keep your head down, work hard. People respect that." David wanted to believe that would be enough. But when he walked into the classroom, the silence hit harder than any words could. Heads turned, conversations paused, eyes lingered. He felt every glance like a spotlight, exposing him. No one had to say anything. The message was already clear. You don't belong here. Still, David sat quietly at the back of the room, opened his notebook, and tried to focus on the teacher's voice. But it was impossible to block out the tension. The whispers, the sideways looks, the unspoken wall between him and everyone else. At lunch, it was worse. The cafeteria buzzed with noise, tables packed with groups of friends. David carried his tray, searching for a place to sit. Every table seemed full, not just of people, but of belonging. He finally sat down alone in the corner, pushing food around his plate more than eating it. Across the room, a group of students laughed at something. He wasn't sure if it was about him, but it didn't matter. His chest tightened anyway. That first day set the tone. Every morning after, David woke up with a knot in his stomach. School wasn't just about learning anymore. It was about surviving, about making it through each day without breaking down, without letting the loneliness swallow him whole. What made it harder was the silence at home. His parents never asked him how it felt. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe they thought he would adjust. Maybe they believed toughness was the only way forward. So David carried it alone, like a heavy backpack he couldn't take off. But deep down, he kept asking himself, how long can I keep this up? How long before I break? And yet what David didn't realize then was that this silence, this invisible weight, would push him toward moments that would define who he became. Not just as a student, but as a person. Because Jefferson High wasn't just a school. It was a mirror of America itself, fractured, divided, searching for answers in a time when skin color still decided who belonged and who didn't. The days at Jefferson High slowly turned into weeks, but for David, nothing felt normal. Every morning when he walked through those doors, the weight of being the only one pressed down on him. He wasn't bullied in the way movies often show it. No one cornered him in the hallway, no fists raised against him. The reality was quieter, sharper, and far more exhausting. He was invisible when he needed to be seen, and glaringly visible when he wished he could disappear. In history class, When groups were assigned for a project, David noticed how quickly everyone paired up. Laughter and chatter filled the room until only he remained unchosen. The teacher, fumbling, finally placed him into a group, but he could feel the unease of the other students. They didn't say much, just exchanged looks. That silence, that hesitation, spoke louder than words. At lunch, the isolation never faded. One afternoon, he carried his tray into the cafeteria and paused. For a brief moment, he wondered if today would be different, if maybe someone would nod, smile, make space at a table. But the hum of conversations continued around him like he didn't exist. He ended up at his usual spot in the corner by the vending machines. That corner became his refuge, his punishment, and his habit. The strange part was that David didn't blame the students. Not really. He knew they had their own battles, their own scars shaped by generations of injustice. Many of them had grown up in neighborhoods where white faces only appeared as teachers, police officers, or landlords. To them, David wasn't just a kid trying to fit in. He was history walking through the door. He was the outsider, a reminder of a world that had often denied them respect, opportunity, and safety. Still, that didn't make it easier for him. The loneliness followed him home, too. His parents, tired from work, rarely asked about his day. His father, in particular, believed in silence as strength. "Just keep your head down," he would repeat. "Don't cause trouble. You'll be fine." But David wasn't fine. He was shrinking inside himself, his voice quieter, his laughter almost gone. One night, as he sat at his desk, staring at his half-finished homework, he heard his mother's footsteps outside his door. She peeked in, carrying a folded pile of laundry. "You okay, honey?" she asked gently. David wanted to say no. He wanted to tell her everything. That he was drowning in loneliness. That he was tired of being stared at like an intruder. That school felt like a place where he had no name, only a skin color. But instead, he forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine." She believed him. Or maybe she wanted to, but cracks were starting to show. There was the time in gym class when the teams were picked, and once again, David was the last one left. A group of boys laughed, not cruelly but knowingly. He joined the game, running up and down the court, but the ball rarely came his way. He wasn't just unskilled, he was unseen. When the final whistle blew, he stood sweating, heart racing, wishing he could melt into the floor. And yet, in the midst of all this, something unexpected began to happen. It was small at first. A nod from a classmate when David handed back a pencil. A quiet thanks when he held the door open. Then, one afternoon, as he sat alone in the cafeteria, a boy named Marcus stopped by. Marcus was tall, confident, the kind of kid who could walk into any room and command attention without saying a word. He looked at David's tray, then at him. "You don't talk much, do you?" he asked. David froze, unsure if it was a challenge or an invitation. "I guess not," he mumbled. Marcus chuckled. "That's all right. Not everyone's loud." And just like that, he walked away. It was barely a conversation, but for David it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Someone had noticed him, not as a symbol, not as a stranger, but as a person. Moments like that gave him hope. But they were fleeting, and for every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back. One Friday, during a history discussion about segregation, a student raised his hand and said, "Why are we even learning this? It's not like anything's changed. They still think they're better than us." His eyes flickered toward David. The room grew tense. David felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his eyes on his notebook, pretending to write. Later, walking home, those words echoed in his head. He knew the student hadn't been speaking only about him, but it still landed like a punch. He didn't want to be seen as they. He just wanted to be seen as David. That night, lying in bed, he asked himself the question that would follow him for years. If I don't belong here, and I don't belong anywhere else, where do I belong? The answer wasn't clear. Not yet. But what was becoming clear was that his time at Jefferson High would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And slowly, quietly, the boy who entered those doors on the first day was changing, because surviving wasn't enough anymore. Somewhere deep inside, David knew he needed to find his voice. It was a Thursday morning in late October. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted winter was close. David walked into Jefferson High with the same heavy steps he had carried for weeks. But today felt different, not because the halls were louder, not because the teachers were stricter. It was because, inside, David was tired. Tired of the stairs, tired of being the last one chosen, tired of pretending he didn't notice the whispers. In English class, the students were asked to share their essays out loud. The topic was simple. What does community mean to you, David? Had written his essay the night before, sitting at his desk under the dim yellow light of his bedroom. His words were raw, honest, maybe too honest. He thought about skipping his turn, maybe pretending he had forgotten it at home. But when his name was called, there was no way out. He stood, paper trembling in his hand, and began to read. At 16, I'm learning that community isn't just about the people around you. It's about whether or not they see you. Some days I walk into this school and I wonder if I'm invisible. Other days I feel like I'm standing under a spotlight, with every eye on me. Not because of who I am, but because of what I look like. Community to me should be about belonging. But right now, I don't know where I belong. The room fell silent. No shuffling papers, no whispering, side comments, just silence. David swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. His voice cracked, but he kept going. I don't want pity. I don't want to be special. I just want to sit at a table and not feel like an intruder. I want to laugh in the hallway and not wonder if I'm being judged. I want to raise my hand in class and not feel like my words carry the weight of history. I just want to be a kid. By the time he finished, his chest was tight, his hands damp with sweat. He sat down, quickly, staring at the floor. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, cleared her throat softly. Thank you, David, she said, her voice unusually gentle. But what happened next was not what David expected. From the back of the room, Marcus, the boy who had once paused by his cafeteria table, spoke up. I didn't know you felt that way. His tone wasn't mocking. It was thoughtful, almost regretful. A few other students exchanged glances. Some looked down, avoiding eye contact. For the first time, David realized something important. While he had been carrying the loneliness like a secret burden, maybe, just maybe, others had been curious about him too. Maybe the silence wasn't just rejection. Maybe it was distance they didn't know how to cross, but not everyone reacted with sympathy. Another boy muttered under his breath, Man, nobody told him to come here. The tension snapped back into the room. The invisible walls, the history, the unspoken pain. It was all still there. David felt a surge of heat in his chest. For weeks he had stayed quiet, swallowed the hurt, walked the halls with his head down. But now, standing on the edge of his breaking point, he turned around. His voice, steady but trembling with emotion, filled the classroom. I didn't choose this school. My parents did. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. You don't have to like me. You don't have to talk to me. But I'm human, just like you. And I'm tired of feeling like I don't exist. The words hung heavy in the air. His eyes stung, but he didn't look away. For the first time, David wasn't invisible. He wasn't silent. He was seen, whether people wanted to see him or not. When the bell finally rang, the students filed out quietly. No one laughed. No one mocked him. Some avoided his eyes, but others glanced at him differently. Not with pity, not with anger, but with something closer to recognition. David walked out of that classroom shaken, heart pounding. But deep down, something had shifted. For weeks he had been surviving. That day, for the first time, he had spoken, and even though the road ahead was still lonely, still complicated, he had found the first piece of something he had been searching for all along: his voice. The day after David read his essay, the hallways at Jefferson High felt different. Not louder, not softer, just different. For weeks, David had walked through those same halls with his shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the linoleum floor, pretending he didn't hear the laughter, the whispers, the silence. But this morning, something had shifted. When he stepped into the building, a few heads turned, like they always did, but this time the stares didn't linger. Some kids even nodded slightly, almost like a silent acknowledgement. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. It was complicated. In the cafeteria at lunch, David sat at his usual corner table. He unfolded, his sandwich slowly, trying not to look around. Then out of nowhere, a shadow fell across the table. He looked up. It was Marcus. "You mind if I sit here?" Marcus asked casually, as though the question meant nothing. But to David it meant everything. For a second, David froze. His first instinct was to say no, to protect himself from another awkward encounter, another moment that would sting later. But then he nodded. Sure. Marcus slid into the chair across from him. They ate in silence at first, the hum of voices, around them filling the space. Then Marcus spoke again. "Your essay, it got me thinking. You said you feel invisible here." He hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess I never thought about what it's like for you. I mean, you're the only white kid in a school that's all of us. That's gotta be hard." David searched for words. He didn't want to sound bitter. He didn't want to sound like he was asking for pity. "It's not just hard," David said quietly. "It's lonely. It feels like, no matter what I do, I don't belong, and I can't change that." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that. Maybe not the same way, but I know what it feels like to not belong." The words landed like an unexpected gift. For the first time, David realized something. He wasn't the only one carrying invisible weight. Marcus had his own battles, different, but just as real. That moment didn't erase the months of stares and whispers. It didn't solve the history written into every brick of Jefferson High, but it cracked open a door. Over the next few weeks, small changes began to unfold. A few kids who had never spoken to David before started saying simple things. "What's up? You done with the homework?" They weren't deep conversations, but they weren't silence either. Mrs. Reynolds, the English teacher, pulled him aside one afternoon. "David, I want you to know your words mattered," she told him. "They didn't just stay in that classroom. They're still echoing. Still, it wasn't easy. Not everyone welcomed him. Some students stayed cold, even hostile. The weight of being different didn't just disappear overnight. But David carried himself differently now. He wasn't invisible anymore. He had spoken, and people had listened, even if they didn't know how to respond. At home, his parents noticed the change too. One evening, while setting the table for dinner, his mom asked gently, "How was school today?" David thought about the cafeteria, about Marcus sitting across from him, about the nods in the hallway, about the silence that had started to feel less sharp. "Better," he said simply, and for the first time in months, he meant it. The falling action of David's journey wasn't about instant friendship or dramatic acceptance. It wasn't about a school, suddenly transforming into a place of harmony. It was quieter than that. It was about survival turning into resilience. It was about one boy finding his voice, and in doing so, reminding others that every story, no matter how uncomfortable, deserves to be heard. By the time spring rolled around, David wasn't the white kid anymore, at least not only that. He was David, the boy who wrote the essay, the one who finally spoke what so many were afraid to say, that the walls of Jefferson High carried not just history, but wounds. The change wasn't dramatic. There was no standing ovation in the cafeteria, no sudden chorus of friendship. Life went on. Classes, basketball games, homework, laughter in the halls. But underneath all of it, something subtle had shifted. David began to notice small details. A classmate holding the door open for him, someone saving him a seat in math, Marcus waving across the hallway. Tiny gestures, almost invisible on their own, but when strung together, they painted a picture of slow acceptance. For the first time, David wasn't walking through those doors each morning carrying only silence. He wasn't naive. He knew that. A single essay hadn't erased generations of division. He knew there were still stares, still whispers, still days when he felt painfully out of place. But he also knew something else, something more powerful. He had learned that speaking truth, even when your voice shakes, can make people listen. At the end of the school year, on the last day of class, Mrs. Reynolds returned their final essays. On David's paper, she had written just one line at the bottom: "Never stop telling your story." David folded the paper carefully, almost like it was something sacred, and slipped it into his backpack. He didn't know what his future would look like: college, work, maybe another school. But he knew this: his story mattered. And in that realization, Jefferson High had given him something he never expected. It had given him resilience. It had given him empathy. It had given him the strength to carry the weight of difference and still stand tall. Because in the end, David's story wasn't just about being the only white teen in a 99% black school. It was about what happens when you're forced to see the world from the outside looking in, and how that perspective can change you forever. And maybe, just maybe, his classmates had learned something too. That understanding doesn't come from sameness, but from listening. As David walked out of Jefferson High for the last time that year, the sun hit the brick walls of the building, casting long shadows across the steps. He paused, looked back one final time, and then stepped forward, toward a future that was still uncertain, but no longer unbearable, because he wasn't invisible anymore. He had a story, and stories have the power to change the world. But the real question is, how many more young people will have to carry the weight of being the only one before schools, before society, finally learns to see beyond color? What do you think? Does being different make you stronger, or just more alone?